Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and this lecture is part two of my series on economic history and development of China. This one focuses on the People's Republic of China under the Maoist period. So again, if there's four phases of modern Chinese economic history, the Qing dynasty, the warlord civil war era, Maoist China, and then the post-1978 to the present period. In my previous lecture, I focused on the first two of these. This one is going to be focused on the third. So let's consider the economic growth and development in China under Mao. Now, I'm considering this period from 1949 to 1978. Mao himself passes away in 1976, but there is a period of chaos kind of that ensues after that. And it's not until the reforms of Deng that I would say the Maoist period really ends. Okay, so I'm using a Marxist class analysis to understand the economy of China, and in this framework, we define class by the relationship between the producer and the appropriator of surplus. We can divide that into five fundamental class processes, and these are the feudal fundamental class process, the slave fundamental class process, the capitalist fundamental class process. And all three of these involve exploitation. Again, by the technical Marxist meaning of this is when someone who is not the direct producer appropriates, owns, controls the surplus that the workers produce, the direct producers produce at the site of production. There are two more: the ancient fundamental class process and the communal fundamental class process. And these are where the workers themselves take and own and appropriate the surplus, either individually, as in the case of the ancient fundamental class process, or collectively, as in the case of the communal fundamental class process. And of course, Marxism has a very strong commitment to minimizing and eventually abolishing exploitation, and focuses a lot more attention on the communal fundamental class process than it does the ancient. And that's because the argument is that the ancient fundamental class process can and often does lead to a more developed form of capitalism, seen as a kind of slippery slope there. The focus is on the collectivity, of course, on communism. All right, so when we look at the economy of China in 1949, here's what we find. Okay, after gaining power, Mao and the Communist Party of China confront a nation that's devastated by decades of war. So a very, very bad situation economically. The economy is very underdeveloped. There is a large rural population that is engaged mostly in subsistence agriculture. Agricultural productivity is low. Industrial development is also at a very low level. And so their main question that they're dealing with is, how do we achieve rapid economic development, industrialization? We have to accumulate capital, but there's not really loans available aside from some aid from the Soviet Union. So a lot of my thinking has been shaped by this book by Satyananda Gabriel called Chinese Capitalism and the Modernist Vision. Excellent book here on China. All right, so when we consider agriculture, okay, agriculture is the base. You can't have much industrialization unless you have a shift of the population from the rural areas to the urban areas to some extent, okay? Now, China has a long history of agriculture. The land has been cultivated intensively. Nearly all of the arable land is under cultivation, and I think this image just kind of shows, the creativity here of the Chinese people in terms of creating more arable land than would normally exist, right, through practices like this, creating these terraces. This land would be very difficult to farm on a very, extreme hill. But, by doing this, which requires, of course, huge amounts of labor, right? By doing this, you can extend the amount of arable land. And this is important because, of course, China has a huge population to feed. Okay, so the Mao and the CPC were very committed to land redistribution and collectivization of agriculture. Now, Mao knew that a lot of his political support came from the peasantry, and he was committed to land redistribution for several reasons, right? First of all, he's well aware of the historical inequalities in the countryside. Landlords take perhaps 50 to 70% of their tenants' crops, Now, even though the class structure that dominates is the ancient fundamental class process, which doesn't technically involve exploitation, just because there's no exploitation in peasant farming, it doesn't mean everything's cool with it, right? I mean, there's exploitation by that very narrow technical meaning, but there's other things that can be wrong, right? I mean, this is wrong that landlords uh, take such a huge proportion of the crops here. Um, Now, Mao also recognizes from very early on that agriculture is going to ultimately have to be collectivized in order to raise productivity. He was a very close student of the Soviet experience of the 1920s, well aware of that history in Russia. So here's a timeline of redistribution efforts from July 7th, 1946. Property of landlords and rich peasant farmers confiscated and redistributed to poor peasants. And then in 1947, we have the elimination of rent and landlord status. Now, there's a large number of people who were either landlords or rich peasants. So about 30 million people fell into those categories, which is more than you had in Russia. You know, in Russia, the holdover of the feudal aristocracy was much smaller. So here we have a massive change in land ownership that's occurring, and it requires an enormous campaign, which the CPC conducts with the help of the peasantry. The peasantry is very enthusiastic about this. There's a death toll, right? I mean, as there always are with things like this, how many people died? It's very difficult to say. The range is perhaps somewhere between 200,000 and 6 million. Now, if that seems like a pretty broad range, yeah, it does to me too. But this kind of range is pretty common in histories of China, and it just shows, you know, there's very little systematic data here, and you know, we're relying on estimates and essentially on guesswork, and you know, that's problematic. But that's a situation with an enormous country that's pretty undeveloped, as China was in 1949 and into the 50s. Uh, you know, it's hard to know what is going on, you know, in that situation. So, given that, right, we have to take any figures basically about, you know, death tolls, especially, right, we have to take with a significant grain of salt. All right, so land redistribution reduces inequality and it eliminates the structurally parasitic landlord class. But it doesn't do much to change this problem, right? The problem of low productivity in agriculture remains. Um, and again, the problem is, right, agriculture needs to be a lot more productive to support a growing population, which the population of China is growing during this period, and also to allow for industrialization, right? We need to free up labor, which is currently being used on farms, so that can transition to factories and manufacturing and so on. So the collectivization of agriculture is seen as the solution here. Now, one problem with agriculture and the way that it's organized, again, it has a very long history. The land has been cultivated for thousands of years in China. So the history and tradition is very, very strong, right? The history is you got small peasant farmers that are producing basically in household units, and this prevents the economies of scale of industrialized agriculture that are newly possible. You know, with new technology, we have the green revolution that has occurred, and yields are rising all over the world. But this requires large plots of land, much more intensive use of capital in agriculture, the new fertilizers and pesticides and so forth. Right, all of these different elements of this green revolution. And there's a lot of barriers to that being implemented in China. And, you know, Mao begins to see the traditional village peasant life as an impediment to progress, as part of this obstacle, right? So there is a first wave of collectivization that occurs in the early 50s, 1949 to 1958. There's a series of efforts to collectivize agriculture. Peasants are at first encouraged and then pressured and, you know, increasingly coerced to join these large collective farms. So this is, again, it's an attempt to solve the economies of scale issue. Uh, so the average collective now is much larger. The productive unit has been expanded. We have 170 families on average, uh, to totaling over 700 people. So okay, now we've increased the scale. Agricultural productivity increased somewhat. Grain production rose 3.5% per year from 1953 to 1957. Um, but again, these efforts are not seen as sufficient. And again, there's the problem of the traditional structure of rural peasant life as an impediment to progress. And so Mao starts to really take aim at that, right? And we have the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 61 or 62. Um, and this is an attempt to really try to change, the cultural practices, the economy, the organization of many aspects of economic life, and all of the other things that touch upon economic life. So not just economics, but also social and cultural practices. So there's a tremendous amount of change, and it's really top to bottom change. So we see here the influence of Mao as a real, revolutionary figure, right? That is somebody who is very committed to pushing the pace of change in this very traditional society, right, forward, and very, very rapidly. Okay. Okay. So in terms of how the Great Leap Forward affects agriculture, uh, so we have the second wave of collectivization that begins in 1958. Private land ownership is abolished. Households are placed in large state-operated communal farms. Uh, some of these are even larger than what I mentioned before. Um, Taxes and compulsory purchases of grain by the state amounted to about 30% of the harvest. So many traditional elements of rural life were abolished or discouraged through the actions of the party. Uh, Divorce was allowed for women. Uh, Certain practices were abolished, like foot binding, child marriage, growing opium, all of these things, right? There's a very strong campaign against opium. Uh, a system of internal passports was created to control migration. So this speaks to one of the problems that they face. They want to industrialize. They know they need to shift the population, some of the population, from the rural countryside to the urban areas, but they want that to be controlled, right? They don't want that to happen too quickly. Uh, and this is a problem that every industrializing society faces because industrialization and urbanization go together, but they're driven by different forces. So, if you have too many people that go into the cities, that causes enormous problems, and so they're they're trying to prevent that through a system that controls internal migration. Now, one of the things that happens here is the Great Chinese Famine. So from 1959 to 1961, obviously it's a very complex thing that happens here in terms of causes. What do we have? Well, the state's compulsory grain purchases may have taken too much of the surplus from the rural countryside, even in parts of the country with large food surpluses. So they had the problem of knowledge that I mentioned before. They have a difficult time knowing exactly what the needs of the populace are, and so do they take too much or too little from the countryside? Um, Now, under normal times, this works fine, but one of the things that happens in 1959 is there's flooding, then there's a drought, and the result is a famine and food shortages. Um, Now, millions of peasants had already been directed away from agriculture and towards industry through a combination of different sorts of laws and other kind of incentives and inducements. Um, there were some ill-advised new theories of agriculture, things like close planting and deep plowing and so on, that probably reduced yields in some places. It's hard to know exactly how significant this was. I tend to think this is probably overblown. There was a four pests campaign that led to a lot of killing of sparrows and other birds. Now, these are birds that eat seed and grain and so on, but they also keep a lid on insects and other kinds of vermin. So when they're removed, you have a lot of other problems that occur. So again, that's ill-advised. Now, how much does that actually matter? How much of that happened? Is that just an anecdote? Um, did it have a real systematic effect on what is an absolutely huge country, right? I mean, how many sparrows got killed? These are very difficult questions to answer. Nobody really knows. So, we that's one of the issues here. When you lack systematic data, then anecdotal stories often, become that's the thing you remember. Um, Now, state officials sometimes believed that the totals of the grain were larger because there was inaccurate tallies. There were, party bureaucrats who inflated figures and so on. They did export grain as well. So this is one of the tragedies of this experience is there was some grain exporting. Now, the reason that they did that is because, again, they thought these were surpluses. They needed to obtain funds for capital accumulation. That was seen as absolutely vital for China's future. So, this is, of course, they didn't want to do that if it was going to cause deaths, right? That's not their goal at all. They have no intention, no desire to reduce the rural populace by that manner, right? That's horrifying. So what we find here is total crop production did decline from 200 to 143.5 million tons from 1958 to 1960. So, the combination of these factors, again, some of them related to natural disasters, some of them related to errors, and the working out of this very new system, right? The system is about 10 years old at this point, and it's an ambitious project to change so dramatically the way that agriculture is organized. Now, we have to just examine this because this is one of the most studied and talked about aspects of Chinese history. Now, because the famine, of course, and also the repression and natural disasters and so forth, all this led to deaths. That's indisputable. However, exactly how many is unknown, and that is highly disputed. Now, the official government estimate is 16.5 million, but there's actually very little evidence to support that number. It has some it has some clout, right? Because that's like their official number, but just because it comes from the government, they have the same data problem that everybody has, right? Which basically is there's very little data. There's a lot of conflicting evidence here. The estimate itself seems to be part of a backlash against Mao that occurred after his death in 1976, and the various political jockeying and so forth that occurred. Now we'll talk more about that later on. Now, other estimates of the death toll of what's called the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961 range as high as 29 million, some say 38 million. These are pretty large figures. What are they based on? Well, like I said, they're not based on anybody actually counting deaths because we don't have that. Instead, what people have are differences between populations. Okay, so these are imputed differences. Okay, they're based on logic, right? That if the population had grown at the growth rate that was present before, based on what we know about the fertility rates and so forth, right? So these are statistical figures. They are based on a lot of assumptions about fertility rates and population growth, and this is pretty problematic, because fertility rates can change. They can fall for many reasons. They don't just fall because of famine. And some of the timing of these estimates is also very problematic because, the famine itself doesn't occur until later than some of this drop in fertility occurs earlier. So a very problematic way of trying to establish a death toll here. It should really be considered a secondary source at best, right? It certainly doesn't prove anything, but it's very common. These are, we have, like, for example, this book called Hungry Ghosts, which uses this methodology, very, very common methodology. At most, these kinds of studies can raise interesting questions, but they're commonly cited as proof that Mao intentionally killed millions, generally accompanied by a hysterical conclusion that Mao was somehow worse than Hitler. So again, these kind of studies of population dynamics are not proof of anything. At most they are, interesting, right? They don't establish a death toll. They certainly don't prove that Mao starved tens of millions. There's just no evidence of that. For that, we would have to have some kind of evidence that says, oh, that was a policy of the CPC or of Mao. That was a goal of theirs. And of course, that is very far from the truth, right? That's not at all their goal. They no desire to kill millions of people, no plan for that. They consider this a disaster too, right? I mean, so there's just no evidence that any of this is intentional. A death toll that's supposedly in the tens of millions is also very difficult to square with other existing facts that we know about the Maoist period. So, for example, life expectancy increased dramatically. Okay, this is nearly a doubling. So it goes from 35. Okay, this is the number of years a person is expected to live at birth. Okay, life expectancy at birth is 35 at the beginning of the Maoist period, and it's 65 at the end of the Maoist period. Right? That shows the quality of life is probably significantly enhanced. Right? Now, a lot of the increase in life expectancy is due to just one factor, which is infant mortality, which also fell dramatically. Now, this is a good in itself, right? Because infant mortality is a great tragedy. Okay, an infant that dies before age 1 is an awful trauma for the entire family, right? This is a tragedy. So any fall in infant mortality is a good thing by itself. But we also know that crop yields per hectare increased 145.9%. Total food production increased by 169.6%. This is very hard to reconcile with supposedly killing millions intentionally. That does not seem to be the result, or again, there's no evidence that was anybody's aim. The population of China also grew by 77% during the Maoist period. So, again, that's hard to square with tens of millions dying. Per capita food production went from 204 to 328 kilograms. Again, these are successes economically, and they don't fit with some kind of alleged attempt to cause some kind of famine. Now, the Great Leap Forward is often described as an economic disaster, and this is part of this kind of overblown, hysterical rhetoric that surrounds China. So let's just take a look at, okay, the Great Leap Forward is this little pink kind of section. Okay, so before the Great Leap Forward occurs, there's lots of other economic changes. And one of the things, of course, that happens is we have rapid economic growth from 1952 to 1960. Real GDP nearly doubles during this period. Okay, so this is China's GDP, and it's measured in billions of 2008 dollars. All right, so this is a remarkable economic feat. Okay, to take a war-torn country that was suffering from decades of warfare. And massive dislocation, a foreign invasion by the Japanese and so forth, to take that and then double the size of the economy in 8 years is an absolutely stunning economic achievement. Okay, now, again, the Mao and the CPC are happy about this, but they're not satisfied, right? They want to continue. They want to remove, they want this to form like, this exponential growth path, right? And so the Great Leap Forward is an attempt to do that. There is a contraction that occurs, okay? The famine and all of these changes associated with the Great Leap Forward do cause a lot of chaos and different issues in China, and there is a contraction that occurs. It's about 20.9%. But again, these things happen in any growth path, right? Consider that the trough here, okay, there's a peak that occurs in 1960 and then a trough. The trough is still a lot higher than where we were in 1952, right? So, yes, there's a contraction, but it's relatively minor. I mean, to say that the Great Leap Forward was an economic disaster, that it devastates the economy, I just don't see that. Where's the evidence of that? 20% contraction in the economy is not great, but capitalist economies also have these, right? I mean, this is par for the course, especially for a rapidly growing economy. Not every year involves growth. However, they do have a very strong record of growth. Growth resumes after this, right? 1962, 1963, etc. By 1965, China has well surpassed its previous peak, and then growth continues after that throughout the Maoist period. So, again, problems and dislocations, yes, that happens, but economic disaster, if this is an economic disaster, then there's a lot of developing nations that would love to see the same kind of disaster happen to them, right? Because this kind of record of economic growth is very, very strong and very rare. Now, it's also very curious, I have to say, returning to the issue of famine, that Mao is the only person who's ever blamed for famine deaths in China, when China has a long history of famine. And in fact, famine came to a decisive end during the Maoist period. So I think probably what would be more accurate would be to say Mao, through the socialist policies of the CPC, it's not Mao alone. None of this ever is. It would be more accurate to say Maoist policies saved lives than it would be to say that they ended lives. But let's look at this in a little more detail. Okay, so here's just a partial list, right? This just goes from 1850. This is the 100 years before the Maoist period. And remember, like I discussed in the previous lecture, this is a period that sees a lot of different chaos. Drought, warfare, etc. We have the Nian Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, a drought that occurs during this period, leads to a lot of deaths. We have the Great North China Famine. We have another famine in northern China. We have the Great Qing Famine, the North China Famine, and there's a lot of these, right? You can see, that famine is clearly a recurring problem, and a lot of these famines have a very significant death toll. Now, all the numbers that are mentioned in this table have all of the problems that I've been discussing, right? Do we know that it's exactly this range? No, we do not, right? There's a lot of stuff we don't know. Some of them have a totally unknown number of deaths. So that's a problem, right? But that's a problem that is throughout this whole period. Of course, that is also true of the 1959 to 61 famine. But if we just take the kind of range of deaths here, right, we'd say, well, in the century prior to the revolution, famine was responsible for maybe somewhere between 55 and 80 million deaths, right? So even if we accept the very likely inflated figure of 16.5 million deaths that are, supposedly attributable to collectivization, then again, it would be much more accurate to say that Mao and the CPC saved tens of millions of lives, right? Saved, not killed, saved. That is the much more accurate context here historically. But, due to the huge amounts of bias and hysteria that surrounds the debate on China or our understanding of Chinese history, that's not typically what we get. So here's a quote from Joseph Ball, who discusses this and says, a lot of times we compare China to, developed countries like in Europe or the United States, because the United States, of course, they're anti-communist. People love to make comparisons like this, right? Um, but, Ball is making the point, well, India would be a much better comparison to China, right? Because this is another nation that is rural. It's agricultural, right? The overwhelming proportion lives in the rural countryside. Uh, and, what that's the country really we should be comparing to. So his quote here is, if India's rate of improvement in life expectancy had been as great as China's after 1949, then millions of deaths could have been prevented. Even Mao's critics acknowledge this. Perhaps this means that we should accuse Nehru and those who came after him of being worse than Hitler for adopting non-Maoist policies that led to the deaths of millions. Or perhaps this would be a childish and fatuous way of assessing India's post-independence history, as foolish as the charges that have been leveled against Mao for the last 25 years. Maybe. All right, so let's examine this second wave of collectivization that occurs and produces the commune system that lasts for the rest of the Maoist period. Okay, these are large-scale collective farms, much larger units, like 30,000 members. They're organized into smaller units called production brigades, themselves divided into production teams of 100 to 250 members. So that's about 30 households. So the household is the unit for many things in China, right? They retain that, the CPC retains that. So the commune owns all the agricultural assets, and members receive shares of net income of the commune, distributed on the basis of how much work had been put in. And families were also permitted to work small private plots and then sell or consume the output. So here's an example. This is a modern image, that's taken from Google Maps. This is State Farm number 128 of the number 7 division. This is 85 miles northwest of Urumqi. It employs 17,000 people. It has military-style checkpoints, irrigated orchards, and cotton fields, as well as its own foreign affairs office, television station, oil refinery, and enterprises for marketing crops and forestry products. So these new communes are much larger scale enterprises. We can kind of see the effect, like from the air. This looks like a lot of agricultural regions in the United States, for example. So this just shows the kind of modernization effort that they've gone into. These circular plots here signal that there's an apparatus for watering and for applying fertilizer that goes around in a circle. So this just shows the kind of progress that's been made here and the vast changes to the structure of agriculture. So here is Dazai. This is China's model village. There's a whole campaign around this, learn from Dazai and so forth. This was seen as a model of development, much more modern. The agriculture had been, fully collectivized into these large agricultural units, and this village was really pushed as an example. Collectivization produced a very different class structure in the Soviet Union and China. So as I discussed in a previous lecture, the Soviet Union, most of these collective farms, the kolkhozy, they did have another category, but this is a minority. Most of them were organized in this manner. They were privately owned by the members, right? The members appropriated their own surplus, making it a case of the communal fundamental class process, and perhaps the largest single instance of the communal fundamental class process produced in the shortest period of time that has ever been seen historically. We don't exactly know, but it's certainly in the modern era. Now in China, we have a different situation. Okay, the collective farms in China were much larger. They're much more closely tied to the party bureaucracy. The members did not own and receive the surplus they produced. They could not leave the farm or the area due to restrictions on migration. They were much more tied to it. And in exchange for production, the collective provided what is called in literature the iron rice bowl. That is a set of benefits, okay, so between education, housing, health care, a guaranteed permanent employment, and a pension. So a set of consumption items that are associated with this. Gabriel argues that it's a modern instance of the feudal fundamental class process, but a different form of it than we see in the history of Europe, a state form. And that's very interesting, right? And a more benevolent form, perhaps, as well, right? That is one which has a lot of guarantees in it of people's consumption that traditional European feudalism did not have. In the words of Tang and Parrish in their 2000 book, Urban Reform in China, the transformation involves a fundamental redefinition of the social contract the government has with society. The socialist social contract promised an egalitarian, redistributionist order that provided job security, basic living standards, and special opportunities for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. In return, the state demanded sacrifices in current consumption, a leveling of individual aspirations, and obedience to the all-knowing party redistributors. All right, now we come to the period of the Cultural Revolution. So that is 1966 to Mao's death in 1976. So this is where we see a cult of personality forming around Mao, and around the Little Red Book, which is, the title of that is quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, but it's all just called the Little Red Book. We have a campaign to again destroy the old ways of thinking. So this is what they call the destruction of the four olds: old customs, culture, habits, and ideas. You have tremendous revolutionary fervor and suppression of dissent by a group called the Red Guard. This is an informal kind of militia, but it's government approved, basically patriotic gangs. This is a period that's very anti-historical, right? It's like China is too much trapped in the past. We need to discard that. It's a very anti-religious, anti-intellectual kind of movement. It really celebrates and uplifts the average person, especially the working person. Many books and libraries are burned. There are purges of the Communist Party. There's a takeover of Shanghai. This is a period of a lot of change. So again, if we look at the class transformations, just to kind of sum it up, okay, so in agriculture, we have this ancient fundamental class process that's dominant, okay, that before the reforms, and that is where farmers produce and appropriate their own surplus, but it's under conditions of very unequal land ownership, and with a landlord class that extracts large rents in crops or cash. So what happened? Well, the landlords are eliminated. There's land redistribution. There's creation of these collective farms and then large-scale communes. This produces a state feudal fundamental class process. The farmers perform the necessary and surplus labor. They deliver that product largely to the state. They get state-supported consumption. That is the Iron Rice Bowl. And farmers have permanent employment, but can't necessarily leave the farm without permission. And again, that sense of being tied to the land, that's very much parallel with European feudalism. The serf had their tenure that gave them certain rights, the right to work the land, but it also carried with an obligation. So a lot of parallels there. Now, in terms of manufacturing, we have a transition from a private capitalist fundamental class process that's small, but it had grown during the 20th century before the revolution. So this is where private capitalists own the means of production. They hire workers who then receive a wage, that's equal to the value of their necessary labor. In Marxism, this is how it's conceived of. Okay, so what happens here? Well, private capitalism is abolished. The means of production are seized by the state, and economic planning coordinates production and distribution. and they try to manage that vis-a-vis the rural areas and so forth. So again, the argument is made that this is a state feudal fundamental class process. The state owns all the means of production. They hire workers who then receive a wage. Again, this is permanent employment. There is not a real market for labor power, which is one of these critical differences between capitalism and other forms. Okay. However, there are wages, and it is organized on the basis of payments to workers, which makes it different from traditional European feudalism. So you have something new here, a state feudal fundamental class process that's unusual. Okay, in terms of households, remember, households are sites of economic production, as Fraud, Resnick, and Wolf show in their 1994 book, Bringing It All Back Home. Households involve production, and that means there's a class structure of the household. That structure is typically organized traditionally. Okay, it's the feudal fundamental class process, right? The man is the lord of the household, and the woman is like the serf. Okay, and this is very much true of the traditional Chinese household. It's very highly patriarchal. There are dowries. There's child marriage. You know, the children are essentially the property of the parents, right? There's a very strong taboo on divorce. So women can't own property, right? All of these things support and really cement in place this exploitation of women inside households. So we have a whole series of different reforms that are designed to raise the status of women, that grant women formal rights, that seek to end or at least very strongly discourage traditional patriarchal practices. But, you know, what we end up with through all this, I mean, the process is incomplete, let's say, right? What we end up with is a kind of, by the end of the Maoist period, is like a reformed feudal fundamental class process, okay? The traditional household still very much exists, but in a much attenuated form. And many of, especially the kind of most oppressive or the worst practices have been very significantly diminished or in some cases abolished. You know, things like foot binding, right? So it's a reformed feudal fundamental class process. Now, further changes occur as we get, you know, into the post 1978 reform period and so on. So the new class structure in China, again, if we're very focused on this issue of how is production organized, who produces and who appropriates, we can see there's large changes in ownership, okay, from the means of production. There is a shift from private to state appropriation in agriculture and in manufacturing, but the communal fundamental class process is actually pretty rare. So if communism means, well, it means a bunch of things, right? But let's say it means a society in which exploitation has been abolished, which is classless, which you know, has abolished money and the value form and so on, then obviously none of that stuff has taken place, right? Not even the abolition of exploitation. In fact, you have some replacement of things that had not been exploitative with things that are. But it's complicated, right? Because even though we have the ending of this ancient class process in agriculture and the replacement with this state feudal class process, life is better in many, many ways, right? So, you know, we don't want to be doctrinaire about the formal definition of exploitation. We want to consider that, but we need to consider everything, right? Societies are complex. But it is pretty clear, though, right, that by our, you know, again, long established understanding of what is communism within Marxism, which has a, you know, pretty detailed understanding of that, then China is certainly not communist, right? Now, these distinctions matter within Marxism. They don't necessarily matter that much outside of it, right? So, you know, of course, China is usually described as socialist or communist because, you know, those outside of Marxism don't care that much about the distinction, right? Because China uses the term communist to describe itself, right? Its own party, which is more of a statement of its aspirations, right, than its actual accomplishments. then China is considered communist. But that's not that's not a very analytical answer. Okay. All right. So it's another question, right? Is China then socialist? So I have another lecture where I just go into some detail about well, what is this? What does this mean, right? There's the thing about socialism is not a very well defined term. There's no particular class structure that's socialist. So, yeah, is it socialist? I mean, Marxists have arguments about this all the time, right? I mean, there's debates around this in China, right? The term that China uses is socialism with Chinese characteristics. So, the idea that you often find in Marxism is that socialism is a kind of bridge or transitional state to progress to communism, which will take time, right? The kinds of things that go into communism, right? Abolition of all forms of exploitation. Well, societies are built on exploitation, right? I mean, we actually do not have a modern society that has ever abolished exploitation. What would that even look like? So, and then what does a transitional state that is making progress toward that look like? How do we know that that's happening, right? I mean, so it's very difficult to answer this question. Is China socialist? Again, Gabriel and others, point out that China still has at base an exploitative class structure. However, if we want to say that China is capitalist or state capitalist, or these different terms that are used, we have to kind of admit that China is doing something very, very different, right? That developing nations do not typically see both strong growth and a lot of progress reducing the worst kind of poverty. Life expectancy increased dramatically, infant mortality fell dramatically, the yields, the population, all this stuff increased. There is a tremendous human benefit to especially the poorest from these policies. So again, if we look at the population of China, we can kind of see this goes back to 1850 to 1950. There's a relatively slight growth, right? And I think this says a lot for this, that there's a lot of chaos going on, right? And that's not great for population growth. So what happens right around the time of the revolution is the population growth really picks up. Okay, so this period, this is the Maoist period. The population nearly doubles. I mean, it grows by 77% during this period. So that's a remarkable thing that happens along with, right? This both helps economic growth and is probably a result of it. All right, if we assess the total record of economic growth during the Maoist period, we've already focused in a little bit on this section, okay? So if we go beyond that and then say, well, all right, so what happened after that? There was some dislocation associated with, especially the beginning of this Cultural Revolution. So there's a decline that occurs here. Again, a lot of the analysis of this is pretty hysterical and says, oh, the Cultural Revolution destroyed the economy. This does not look like an economy that's been destroyed to me. That looks like a contraction, which is, again, common in all paths of industrialization. What we know when we look at it on a big picture level, this period, okay, from 1949 to 1978, this nearly 30-year period, had total economic growth of 615%, okay, and that's in real terms. That's an average annual growth rate of 8.2%. That is a stunning record of economic success. And, again, many developing countries would love to be able to emulate this. But we have to give Maoist China its due. It produced rapid economic growth, and that was their priority, right? And, again, is my analysis some kind of earth-shattering thing that, the Marxists of China are not familiar with? I don't think so, right? I think that anyone who studies this seriously is going to acknowledge, well, yes, of course, we did not eliminate exploitation. Um, we had other concerns, right? We're trying to eliminate famine. We're trying to eliminate one class that is obviously a parasite, right? Is not only endangering the lives of the rural poor, but is also holding back the progress of the entire country, right? Um, that takes work to displace that, right? So, and in the meantime, then that doesn't leave social and economic energy to change other things about the society, right? It's a process, and the beginning of the process is this exact thing, right? We don't want to have shared poverty. We need to share the wealth, right? To share the wealth, we need to produce more wealth. So that's the focus, right? Rapid industrialization, and again, that was achieved. So that was the goal, right? They did achieve that. They did modernize the economy despite great challenges. There was a human cost in lives lost. We have to acknowledge that. Uh, but there's also a tremendous benefit in terms of lives saved and improved, and that is very often lost in the conversation here. All right, that's my lecture. Thank you very much.